Europe. And so that's the first thing, is that for various political reasons, a lot of it to do with the nuclear power debate, the governments haven't invested or haven't allowed investment to take place early enough. And so there is a chance the lights will go out for that reason. Then there are the geopolitical issues like Russian gas, which could be cut off at any time. And in fact, the Russians did recently announce they're going to start turning the gas off to the Ukraine again. And then there's the whole issue of peak oil, which is still slightly an open question. But, the whole question of whether we want to be dependent on the Middle East for oil, which in any case we know is damaging the environment. So there are those issues, those sort of geopolitical issues about who's going to supply us with our energy. There's the issue of the fact that we're polluting every time we use that energy. There's the cost of that energy. There's the fact that that energy used to be owned publicly, largely by public corporations that operated for the general good, but is now largely owned by private corporations, which are operating purely to return a profit to their shareholders.
Yeah.
So for each of those reasons, an individual might decide that it'd be better off if they were supplying their own energy. And also in each of those reasons, especially for environmental reasons, but also for all the other reasons, look at ways of reducing our energy consumption. There's a chapter in my book about the early days of the grid, of why the grid was built in the first place. And what I was very interested to discover when I did the historical research was that our vast energy consumption in our homes was fostered and created and encouraged by, of course, the energy companies.
Yeah.
It was the energy companies that sold us fridges and cookers. It was the energy companies decided that they didn't need to be terribly efficient. It was the energy companies that taught us that central heating was a good thing, that we ought to be able to stroll through our homes, wearing a T-shirt in the coldest days of the year. Whereas only less than a century ago, we would expect to have one room warm and wear warm clothes in winter, which is surely a more natural way of doing things. So this vast energy industry is exploiting us by having lulled us all through very effective advertising, by the way, into thinking that we ought to be spending huge amounts more on energy than we actually need to.
A very good point. And if we continue on that thread, Nick, in terms of solar panels, installations of those, as far as I try to keep an eye on this as much as I can as well. But there seems to be coming out new brands and new kind of models, updated versions, which seems to be better and better all the time. Do you guys over at the website keep a good eye on this as well, and how to go about what to buy and what not to get, and how to install and things like this?
We do, and it is a constantly changing scenario. And also it does depend very, very much on an individual circumstances. But I think the best general advice I'd give people is to try not to do it on a single household level. So if you live in a street, then try and get the street to buy a bigger wind turbine, because bigger wind turbines are much more effective, more easy to maintain. They break down less because they've got a lot of moving parts. And if you live in a block of flats, instead of letting your organic waste, like your sewage and your vegetable waste, just be taken away by the sewage company and the dustman, then in a block of flats, you could build something called an anaerobic digester in the basement. And all the toilets could go down to the basement, and you could produce from that all the gas you need for all the energy you need. That's what happens in every village in China. There are 34 million of those anaerobic digesters. Local ones at village level. And we could have them here. We could have them in Europe. We could have them in America. And it would just be a question of the regulations being adapted and of course, an industry springing up to service it. At the moment, of course, there isn't a company that would be able to install 34 million anaerobic digesters. And if anybody would like to get together with me to start such a company, then please do get in touch. I should say that I've got a book coming out in America next year called Off-Grid America, which is the results of my trips around America this year, and I'm still finishing it. It's going to be published by Penguin. And I very much hope that when I launch that book, it'll also be at the same time launching an off-grid power company, which will start supplying power to communities in that way. And I want the communities to own their own power. So, you know, there are a lot of companies at the moment which are making large sums of money by installing power, you know, renewable energy, taking advantage of people's goodwill towards green things, and then just simply charging the same as the utility company. But the business model which I would like to see happen is that communities own their own power. And my company's job would simply be to facilitate that, would be to kind of negotiate on their behalf with the wind turbine company and the local electricity company, because, of course, they still own the actual network into each home, and there's no reason to build another one. And to sort of produce a fair business deal by which the local community gets its electricity for free and sells any surplus back, and the electricity company gets a fair price for any electricity that's still needed.
So what you're talking about pretty much here is more independent cells, so to speak, within cities as well, which means that every little part takes care of itself at first hand, but then if there's any surplus, as you say, this could be routed elsewhere and helped other cells around the city, you know, to take care.
A bit like the sort of the internet for power.
Yeah.
And and it'd be silly to kind of cut off from the grid. But at the same time, the grid might end up withering away because, you know, there'd be much less need for it.
Yeah.
So, you know, at times of peak energy, that's when the grid might still be needed. At times of peak energy consumption, which is to say, you know, during the World Cup, during the advertising break of the World Cup in midwinter, you'd certainly still need the grid.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not
about...
about...
a lot of the time, local power could be produced that would satisfy local demand, and if there was any surplus, it could be routed to the next door location. It wouldn't necessarily have to go back into the grid.
Right, right.
Or it could be stored in hydrogen tanks or various other means of storage.
So I did want to ask you a little bit later here in terms of the Off-Grid America, the new book you have, and the previous book, which seems to be more maybe UK based and what the differences there are, you know. But if we just quickly look at the term of like green labeling, for instance, or something being organic is kind of, well, it's hip now in one way. Just as long as you put a green stamp on something, it's okay and we go ahead. But the question is there, of course, are we getting the real thing, so to speak? Is there a danger here as well that we might end up in a position that as long as we see an approved stamp on something which has a green color to it, we automatically think, oh, okay, it's better, I'm doing something for, you know, improvement of the world or whatever, and we move on without thinking more about it? What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, well, the first problem is that manufacturers have realized that there's a big price premium for a green stamp, and the first question you have to ask yourself is it really green at all? I mean, there have been loads of successful prosecutions by now for a product which calls itself organic and isn't.
Yeah.
And so the first question is, how do you know for sure that this is an organic product? And then the second question is if you're not talking about things like food or vegetables, the second question is, although it might be a bit more green in some ways, what about the entire production chain? If you take a product like Ecova, for example, which is a so-called ecological washing powder and a range of washing up liquids, well, when that started, that was a fantastic company that was all operated out of one small production unit in the London area, but now it's owned by Procter & Gamble, and it's just part of a vast multinational, and it's their green brand, and you know, it's no longer obvious that that brand is green from start to finish. It may be that its product is slightly less harmful for the environment, but what about the vast trucks that deliver it around the country? What about the packaging? What about the advertising? So, in a way, it's hardly any greener than any other product.
Yep. That's something to definitely consider. And what about if we look at, you know, money systems, alternative to that? There's alternative currencies out there as well, something called the LETs that you probably have heard